So, Be'ez Hashem, today we'll be going through the first part of the sugya of Trisa. We'll be going through the machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash in Tchilasa Isa v'Seifei Sufkanin. Essentially, we'll be focused on the Tesis on Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, page 6 in the Maram Kaimis pages. We will be touching on the Tesis in Psachim on the Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, and we'll be touching on the Rosh in Psachim also. I won't be discussing extensively L'shenis of the Rishonim, but the Ikar Maram Kaimis will be on in Psachim. The Sugi in Psachim, the Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, the Rosh there in Ois Tezayin, and the Rama Fanart.
Okay, we're going to try. We'll do our best right now to see if we can get to the Taisus and Psachim, and at least in the Rush. So, and try to put it up as the Rav speaks. Okay.
Okay.
Let's start with page 6, Rav Martin.
We'll begin b'siyata d'shmaya with the Taisus Dibra Maska LECHEM ha'osi lekutach, and the kasha that Rabbeinu Tam asks on the Gemara. Taisus says, "V'hainu kisha'osoi kilimudim, u'pirush Rashi isa shemiyabshin b'chama." Rashi therefore explains that the case of lechem ha'osi lekutach is an ordinary isa. It's ordinary dough, prepared in the same way as any dough would be prepared to eventually be baked into lechem. And what makes lechem ha'osi lekutach unique is Rashi explains because it's an isa which is not then subsequently baked in an oven, but Rashi says, the Rashi is at the very bottom of the Amud, Rashi says, Ein oifen oisa b'tanur elo b'chama. The dough is subsequently dried and prepared in the sun and not in an oven. In short, we are describing a case, according to Rashi, where the isa begins as a conventional isa, it's a conventional dough, but the final preparation of the dough before it's used to be eaten is prepared in the chama. This then is the basis of a kasha which Taisus asks on Rabbeinu Tam, and Be'ez Hashem, towards the end of the limud, we'll discuss how the Rishonim resolve this question on Rabbeinu Tam, but we'll begin the limud by setting out a fundamental machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the other Rishonim, notably, usually quoted by the other Rishonim as the Shita of the Rash Mishantz in his Pirush on Chala, but consistent with the Shita of the Rash is also the Ramban in Hilchas Chala, the Rosh both in Psachim and in Hilchas Chala, the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos and Chala, and others. The machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash center around a Mishnah in Masechta Chala, and the machlokes of that the Gemara in Psachim then brings based on this Mishnah. Let's continue in the Taisus on page 6, and we'll then set out this machlokes. Zok Taisus v'koshe, the Armilim b'Maseches Chala, koshe tchilosoi isa v'soifoi sufkenin chayeves b'chala. The Mishnah in Masechta Chala said that anything that begins as an ordinary dough, v'soifoi sufkenin, even though subsequently it's not baked in a conventional way, but is either dried in the sun, or it's cooked, or it's fried in a substantial amount of shemen, says the Mishnah chayovim b'chala, despite the fact that in the isa ultimately is not baked in a conventional way, it's not baked in a tanur, it's chayav b'chala. V'chol shetchilosei sufkenin v'soifoi isa, if the isa begins as a non-conventional isa, it begins as what's called a belila raka. The soifa isa, but in the end it is baked conventionally. In that case, chayovim nami b'chala. The isa is also chayav b'chala. The only case that the Isa is potter, says Tosfos, is shetchilosei sufkenin v'soifei nami sufkenin. Namely, it begins as a blila raka, and ultimately is not baked in a conventional way, but is either cooked or fried or in the sun. In that case, it's potter min achala. Upasak Rabbeinu Tam. And that's the way Rabbeinu Tam paskins. So what Rabbeinu Tam is describing is two cases. A case where we begin with a conventional Isa, but the Isa isn't subsequently baked, but is prepared to be eaten by a different form of heat, either bishul or tigun or in the shemesh, in the chama. In that case, says Rabbeinu Tam, we have a Mishnah that as long as it was tchilosei Isa, it began as a conventional Isa, despite the fact that ultimately it was not baked in a tanur, the Isa is chayev in challah. So to the opposite, says Rabbeinu Tam, in a case where the Isa began as a blila raka, it began as a non-bread dough, but then was baked in a conventional way so that it now has the form of a bread dough. It was ultimately baked. In that case, says Rabbeinu Tam, it's also chayev b'challah. The chiddush here being that according to Rabbeinu Tam, we see two dinim in the Mishnah, each one in and of itself is a chiddush. In the first din of the Mishnah, Rabbeinu Tam is saying that even if the Isa ultimately was not baked, and not just that, says Rabbeinu Tam, and this will be clear from the Rishonim, even if one's intention at the point where the Isa was prepared was not to bake the Isa, but either to cook it or to fry it or to leave it to dry, like Rashi says, in the sun, still, says Rabbeinu Tam, chiyuv chalo depends on one thing, which is gilgul. Dahainu, if it was needed in the form of a conventional Isa. And therefore, says Rabbeinu Tam, it's not just irrelevant what happens ultimately to the Isa, and even if the Isa is subsequently baked or subsequently cooked, the Isa is chayev b'chala because of its conventional gilgul. But says Rabbeinu Tam, even if the intention b'shas gilgul was to not to bake the Isa, but just to cook it or to fry it or to prepare it in the sun, still, says Rabbeinu Tam, chiyuv chalo depends entirely on the din of gilgul. And what happens subsequently to the Isa, says Rabbeinu Tam, is never relevant, because the klal in hilchas chalo is that the chiyuv of the Isa depends only on shas hagilgul. And the Rosh in Psachim brings a number of rayas of Rabbeinu Tam. How we know that chayvas chalo is dependent on shas hagilgul, and therefore Rabbeinu Tam says whatever subsequently happens to the Isa doesn't change the din of challah, even if one's intention b'shas hagilgul was that lebasoif the Isa would not be baked. That's the first din of the Mishnah, which Rabbeinu Tam says is kol shetchilosa Isa. If b'shas hagilgul it had all the characteristics of a bread dough, even though soifai sufganin, in the end it was not prepared, it was only cooked or fried or put in the sun, still the chiyuv challah depends on shas gilgul. That's the ratio of the Mishnah. The seif of the Mishnah that says kol shetchilosa sufganin b'soifai Isa means even an Isa that was prepared as a non-bread dough, and it was prepared in what's called in the Rishonim a blila raka, namely a very thin dough that ordinarily wouldn't be turned into bread, but would be prepared in some other way. It would be cooked, it would be fried, or it wouldn't be prepared ultimately in bread form. Says Rabbeinu Tam, if ultimately it's baked and it emerges in a bread-like form, in that case, says Rabbeinu Tam, there will be a chiyuv challah. Now the Achronim explain that this is also a separate chiddush from the Reisha, and that is that even though Rabbeinu Tam said in the Reisha that chiyuv challah depends entirely on gilgul, on the time of the kneading, and we don't consider the issue of what ultimately the Isa would become, as long as it was a conventional dough b'shas gilgul, Says Rabbeinu Tam, though, that even if something wasn't a conventional bread dough b'shas Gilgul, it's a bli l'raka, if ultimately it's baked in the form of lechem, it can become chayiv. Why? Because we find a separate mechayiv in challah. The Rishonim explain there's two mechayivim in challah. One is shas Gilgul, and then the din is that even if something was potter b'shas Gilgul, nonetheless, if afterwards it is in bread form and it becomes chayiv b'shas afiyah, then there is a separate mechayiv of a hoya ba'ochlechem milechem ha'aretz, that where it became a lechem b'shas afiyah, in that case it can become chayiv. And therefore Rabbeinu Tam is mechadish, that even if the isa begins as a bli l'raka, nonetheless, if b'shas afiyah it is baked in conventional pas form, says Rabbeinu Tam, in that case the isa is also chayiv. So to summarize, Tosfos has brought a Mishnah in Masechta Challah. The first din of the Mishnah is Kol shetchilosoi isa v'soifoi sufkenin chayeves b'challah, which according to Rabbeinu Tam means that the isa began as a conventional bread dough, even if ultimately it was finished to become edible, not through afiyah, not in an oven, and even if one's intention at the point of the preparation of the dough was ultimately to prepare it, not in a way of afiyah b'tanur, nonetheless chayav b'challah, because says Rabbeinu Tam, chiyuv challah is totally entirely on shas Gilgul. That's the ratio of the Mishnah. The seif of the Mishnah is kosher tchilosei sufkenin v'seifei isa is chayavim b'challah. Says Rabbeinu Tam, that's talking about where it began as a bli l'raka, which ordinarily would mean that it wouldn't be chayav b'challah because this is not an isa of lechem, but v'seifei isa, if ultimately it was prepared as lechem, it becomes chayav in challah b'shas. It becomes chayav in challah b'shas afiyah. Chayavim nami b'challah. The only case, says Rabbeinu Tam, that one could be potter from challah is tchilosei sufkenin v'seifei nami sufkenin. The isa began as a bli l'raka. Subsequently, it was prepared and not baked in a conventional way, but either cooked or fried or left in the chama. In that case, says Rabbeinu Tam, we have neither condition. We neither had a conventional isa b'shas Gilgul, nor did we have a mechayiv b'shas that afiyah that it became pas, and therefore says Rabbeinu Tam, in that case the isa would remain potter. The key principle, therefore, according to Shittas Rabbeinu Tam, is that the mechayiv of challah ordinarily is totally on shas Gilgul. If it's not present b'shas Gilgul, then in that case it become present b'shas afiyah. Lu'umas the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, there is the shita of the Rash Mishantz, where the Rash Mishantz proves from our sugya that Rabbeinu Tam's din cannot be correct. Why? And this is the actual kasha which Tosfos asks on Rabbeinu Tam, and this kasha is the proof of the Rash to argue on Rabbeinu Tam. What's Tosfos' kasha on Rabbeinu Tam? Tosfos' kasha on Rabbeinu Tam was v'koshe d'amrina b'maseches challah, etc. What was Tosfos' kasha? Tosfos' kasha is that Rashi defines that lechem ha'osi lekutach means a conventional dough, which is then not baked in an oven, but is prepared to be eaten in the chama. Now, according to Rabbeinu Tam, why does it say that according in the Gemara, that lechem ha'osi lekutach is potter from challah? Harei lechem ha'osi lekutach begins as a conventional isa. It's only how subsequently it's finished. Rashi says in the chama, that makes it potter. According to Rabbeinu Tam, finishing an isa b'chama shouldn't change the din. If it begins as an ordinary isa, then there should be no change based on what happens after the isa is prepared. And more than that, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, even if one's intention was b'shas Gilgul, that ultimately it would be prepared b'chama and not prepared in the tanur, still according to the Shittas Rabbeinu Tam, it's chayiv b'challah. So how can the Gemara then say that lechem ha'osi lekutach is potter min hachallah? Now we'll return to see the answer of Rabbeinu Yono to this kasha of Rabbeinu Tam, where Rabbeinu Yono will establish a chidush that there are some cases where even according to Rabbeinu Tam, certain intentions b'shas Gilgul can accomplish p'tur of chala. But this kasha is the basis of the Rash Mishans, as we mentioned, brought by the Rosh, and other Rishonim go in the Shittas Rishonim, the Rambam Pershim Mishnais, and others, where the Rash Mishans proves the exact opposite of Rabbeinu Tam. That Rabbeinu Tam, who says that everything in that determines the chiyuv of chala, depends on what the isa is b'shas Gilgul, and therefore if the isa is chayiv b'shas Gilgul, what the Isa subsequently becomes, or even one's intention to be goymer the Isa, not through afiyah, doesn't change the din. The Rash Mishan says exact opposite. That what the din of the Isa will be depends on one's das b'shas Gilgul. And if one's das b'shas Gilgul is that the Isa will not be prepared in a tanur, then the Isa is potter. Masha'enkein, if one's das is that the Isa will be prepared in the tanur, in that case, the Isa is chayiv. Just to mention briefly, the Rash Mishans brings two other proofs to show that the intention b'shas Gilgul determines the din of chiyuv chala. One is that if someone needs a dough, he's oisi Isa amanas l'chalek, that the dough after preparation will be divided up amongst other people, and therefore no one person will have a shir challah which he'll then bake. In that case, the Mishnah says that oise isa manas l'chalek is potter min hachallah. Zot the Rash Mishans, harei b'shas Gilgul, the isa has a shir. It's only the das of the person that subsequent to Gilgul of the isa, subsequent to needing the isa, he'll then divide the isa into others. Zot the Rash Mishan. So again, we see this din that the das of the person b'shas Gilgul determines the halacha of chala. A third case Rabbeinu Tam brings, the Rash Mishan brings, is a din of isa saroyim. Isa saroyim means a isa which can either be used to be eaten by royim. It's a rafa kind of isa that's eaten by royim, that's eaten by a shepherd. But sometimes they will give the Isa to be eaten to their klovim. So the Mishnah establishes that Isa Saroyim depends on what the kavanah it was made for. If it was made for the roya to eat from, so it was made l'machal odom, in that case it's chayav b'chala. If it was eaten for the kelev, then in that case it's potter from chala. Zot the Rash, again we see that the das of the person making the Isa, whether it will be for achilas odom or it will be for achilas kelev, that determines whether or not b'shas Gilgul the Isa is chayiv. So the Rash says we now have a number of proofs, not like Rabbeinu Tam, that the chiyuv chala doesn't just depend on Gilgul, but the Isa chiyuv chala does depend on what subsequently happens to the Isa. Ad kedei kach, says the Rash Mishans, that because the din of chala depends not only on shas Gilgul, but on subsequently the Isa will be done with the Isa. Therefore, says the Rash Mishans, one's das b'shas Gilgul then determines what the din of the Isa will be. So to summarize, the three proofs are: one, the kasha that Tosfos asks on Rabbeinu Tam in our Gemara, that we see that even though lechem osilu kutach begins as an ordinary Isa, still, because it's finished b'chama, it is potter. Second, oisi Isa manas l'chalek, where b'shas Gilgul, the intention to be mechalek the Isa determines the din of the Isa. And thirdly, Isa saroyim, where the intended use of the Isa for be machal odom or for machal be'ema, for the klovim, that determines whether or not the Isa is chayav b'chal. So we have, in short, a machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash Mishans. And to use the Hagdara of the Sefer Chalas Lechem in Siman Ches, the Chalas Lechem says that what it would seem is that the principle of the machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash Mishans is that according to Rabbeinu Tam, everything depends on the metzius of the Isa. If the metzius of the Isa is that it's an Isa of Lechem, then it's chayav b'chala. If the metzius of the Isa is that it's a blilo raka that ordinarily wouldn't be an Isa of Lechem, then in that case it's potem and achala, unless it has a new mechayev, a second mechayev of shas afiyah, where it becomes lechem. According to the Rash Mishans, it would seem just the opposite. The metzius of the isa is not malu umayrid. The isa could be an isa of lechem, and what determines the chiyuv chala is what ultimately will become, what the isa will turn into. If the isa will turn into lechem, it's chayiv. If it won't, it won't. And therefore, according to the shita of the Rash, what determines the chiyuv b'shas gilgul of chala is the intended use of the isa. Whereas according to the Rabbeinu Tam, we never find this concept that the intended use of the isa in any way determines the din of chala. So ba'ofen that we have a machlokes mikotze lakotze. According to Rabbeinu Tam, chiyuv chala depends only on the metzius of the isa, and das is irrelevant. Masha Enken, according to the Rash, it's the opposite. The metzius of the isa does not determine the din. What determines the din is the intended use of the isa, and therefore the chiyuv is totally on the machshava b'shas gilgul, which Rabbeinu Tam says the machshava b'shas gilgul is irrelevant. Hence, Tosfos has asked the kasha, which, as we mentioned, Tosfos won't answer specifically, but the Rabbeinu Yonah will address. How do we understand our Gemara of lechem ha'osi l'kutach that is chayiv b'chala? Now, before we return to Shitas Rabbeinu Tam, like we said, to be miyasher how Rabbeinu Tam understands our Gemara, we are going to elaborate a little more on the Shita of the Rash and the Rishonim that are Oimed b'Shitas Rash. And the reason for that is because Me'ikar Hadin, we lahalacha are noiket, as is Mavur and Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Chala, and also in the Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Brachos, we are noiket be'ikar lahalacha like the Shita of the Rash Mishans. If we turn to the Shulchan Aruch pages, in Siman Kuf Sameches, in Sif Yud Gimel, which in the pages of the Shulchan Aruch is on page 186. So the Shulchan Aruch says the following. Afilu dovar shebelilosoi ava. Even something whose belila is a belila ava, namely it's a conventional bread dough. Im bishloi oy tignoi, if subsequently it was cooked or subsequently it was fried, ein mevarech olav hamoitzi afilu sheyesh aleh terisa denahama ve'afilu nischayva bechala de birchas hamoitzi eino hoilech elo achashas afia. Now, the Shulchan Aruch has discussed two cases. One case of dover sheblilosei ava. If it was bishloi tignoi, we don't make hamoitzi, even if it has terisa denahama. Now that didn't seem to be straightforward, because in a case of a belila ova, which was then cooked or baked, according to the shita of the Rash Mishans, where the intention was to prepare the isa in the form of by cooking it or by frying it, in that case it never had a chiyuv chala, it never had a teras lechem b'shas lisha, and therefore there's no reason to make hamoitzi because there's nothing giving it to teras lechem. But the Shulchan Aruch then goes on to describe a second case where he says, "Va'afilu nischayva b'chala." Even in a case where, despite the fact that it will be prepared through bishul or tigun, it would still be chayav b'chala. Now, what's that case? What is the case where despite the fact that it was cooked or baked, nonetheless, still it's chayav b'chala? What would that case be? Hare, the Shulchan Aruch is clearly paskening like the Rash, that if a conventional isa was cooked or baked, and the intention was to cook or bake it, in that case, it's potter from chala. The Shulchan Aruch is now saying, "Va'afilu nischayva b'chala," even in a case where it would be chayav chala, still, the Rash Mishans, the bracha will be still follow what the form of the isa is, b'shas afiyah, and b'shas afiyah, since it was cooked or baked, it doesn't have the bracha of hamoitzi. What's that case? So here we come to a chiddush in the shita of the Rash. We'll recall that Rabbeinu Tam, if we look back to the Tosfos, if you just go back for a moment to page 6, we'll recall that Rabbeinu Tam based his chiddush that everything depends on Shas Gilgul. He based it on the Lashon of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says, "Tchilosoi isa v'soifoi sufkinin chayeves b'chala." So says Rabbeinu Tam, I have a Mefurish Mishnah. Tchilosoi Isa, even if the Isa initially was prepared in a conventional way, it's a usual Isa, and in the end it was Seifei Sufganin, ultimately it was baked, what the Isa ultimately becomes is irrelevant. Everything depends on Shas Gilgal. So how does the Rash Mishans understand that line in the Mishnah, that din of the Mishnah, of Tchilosa Isa v'Seifei Sufganin Chayevas, according to Rash Mishans, that's not true. The mechayev of chalot depends on what it ultimately becomes. So what's the case of Tchilosa Isa v'Seifei Sufganin? So says the Rash Mishans that the case of Tchilosa Isa v'Seifei Sufganin describes a case of Nimlach, which means that when the Isa was originally prepared, his intention was to bake it, and then ultimately when it came in that case, I agree to Rabbeinu Tam that the din of the Isa was determined b'shas Gilgal. Why? Zot Rash Mishan, it's the only time where I say that the purpose of the Isa determines the din is only if one's intention b'shas Gilgal was subsequently to cook or to fry or to prepare in the cham of the Isa. So in that case, b'shas Gilgal, its din was determined al shem soifai. But where the din b'shas Gilgal was that its intention was it should be baked, says Rabbeinu Tam, says Rash Mishans, in that case, I agree to Rabbeinu Tam that the chiyuv challah was determined b'shas Gilgal, and if subsequently he was nimlach, and subsequently he then changed his mind and decided in that case that he would not bake the Isa, but cook it or fry it, nonetheless, says Rash Mishans, the din is that the Isa remains chayav b'challah. So to summarize, the sheet of the Rash Mishans is that what determines the chiyuv of challah is ultimately what's done with the Isa. And therefore the machshava b'shas Gilgal determines the din. But Zot the Rash Mishans, because the machshava b'shas Gilgal determines the din, literally someone's machshava was to bake the Isa, and then subsequently changed his mind, and then decided that he's not going to bake the Isa but cook it, says the Rash Mishans, the Isa already became chayiv. Therefore, says the Shulchan Aruch, if you go back to page 186, that Lo Meboya, says the Mechaber, if the Isa was never chayiv b'challah, because b'shas Gilgal the machshava was that the Isa would be cooked, says the Rash Mishans, in that case the bracha will be bar minim azonis because it never had the status of challah. But says the Shulchan Aruch, even in a case where b'shas Gilgal it did have the chiyuv of challah, nonetheless, since ultimately it was prepared in the form of bishul, the din would be that it would be potter. So this is the din of the Shulchan Aruch. Then the Shulchan Aruch brings a sheet of Rabbeinu Tam, v'yesh cholkim ba'omrim, and some argue, the Isa began as a conventional pass. The din is that it's determined by the Shas HaGilgal, v'yorish shamayim yetze yedei shneim. So Me'ikra Adin, we follow the Shita of the Rash. So what we are going to discuss are two dinim in the Shita of the Rash Mishans, and subsequently we'll come back to the Mishnah Brura on this. Mechaber. But we are going to discuss two dinim of the Rash Mishans. That so far we've explained that the Rash Mishans means that one's machshava b'shas Gilgal determines what the Isa is going to be. And therefore, despite the fact that the Isa was a bread Isa, if the machshava was b'shas Gilgal, that it should be prepared through bishul, the Isa is potter. However, the Rash Mishans concedes that if b'shas Gilgal one's machshava was that the Isa should be baked, even if then subsequently it was cooked, Shas HaGilgul determined the Chiyuv. All of this so far that we've seen in the machlokes between the Rash and Rabbeinu Tam, as the Mechaber just summarized it, is speaking about a conventional bread isa that is then prepared in a form of non-afir, bishul, tigun, bechama, and so on. And the machlokes between the Rash and Rabbeinu Tam is the machshava b'shas gilgul what determines it, or the metzias of the isa? What we then want to know, according to the Rash Mishans, is what would be in the case of a blila raka. If we go back again to Tosfos on page 6 of the Mara Makaimis, we have the second part of the Mishnah, which Rabbeinu Tam explained. Tchilosa sufkenin, v'soifoi isa, chayovim bechala. So we explained, based on the Achreinim, the Teres Haaretz, that Rabbeinu Tam understands that second din of the Mishnah, that if it's tchilosa sufkenin, if it's prepared as a non-bread dough, v'soifoi isa, and ultimately it's baked, in that case, says the Rabbeinu Tam, the shas ha'afiyah is enough to be mechayev the lechem. How did the Rash Mishans understand this din of the Mishnah? What is the case of tchilosei sufkenin v'soifoi isa? What's that case? So the Rash Mishans explains, and I'll summarize the dinim again in a moment. The Rash Mishans explains that this is referring not like Rabbeinu Tam, that it's a blila raka, but again, it's referring to a conventional isa, but the intention was originally to prepare it in the form of sufkenin, namely he was going to be cooked. And what did he ultimately do? V'soifoi isa, ultimately he changed his mind and he baked it. In that case, says the Rash Mishans, he's chayiv. So to summarize, the Rash Mishans learns, different to Rabbeinu Tam, that both cases of the Mishnah of tchilosoi isa v'soifoi sufkenin and tchilosoi sufkenin v'soifoi isa are referring to cases where the person changed their mind from his original intent. So in the first case of the Mishnah of tchilosoi isa v'soifoi sufkenin, it meant that originally he planned to bake it and then changed his mind and cooked it. Says the Rash Mishans, changing your mind does not help to pater the isa, because b'shas ha'gilgul it was chayiv. The second case of the Mishnah says the opposite. If b'shas gilgul of a conventional isa he planned to bake it, which really means it was pater b'shas gilgul, and then ultimately b'shas ha'afiyah he baked it, he's chayiv despite the fact that it was pater b'shas gilgul. So therefore we have in the simple pshat of the Mishnah that Tosfos brings a machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash what the cases are. Rabbeinu Tam learns tchilosoi isa means a conventional dough. V'soifoi sufkenin means whatever happens to it, it's chayiv because everything depends on shas gilgul. And that's Tosfos' kasha from our Gemara of lechem ha'asi l'kutach. The Rash says that's not the case. The case is that we're talking about where the person changed their mind. So the ratio of the Mishnah that says tchilosei isa v'soifoi sufkenin means his intention was to bake it, even if afterwards he cooked it, it remains chayav b'chala. Rabbeinu Tam says that the second case of the Mishnah of tchilosei sufkenin v'soifoi isa isn't referring to conventional bread dough, because as soon as it was a regular isa, it would be chayav. It's talking about a blila raka, and a blila raka can be chayav with the afiyah later. Says the Rash Mishans, I disagree, that's not what the Mishnah is saying. The Mishnah is again describing a blila ava. The case was he originally intended to cook it, and then opposite changed his mind to bake it. Says the Rash Mishans, it's chayiv. So the key question, and this is very negei lahalacha in Hilchos Chala, and this will lead to the shita of Rabbeinu Yoino and how he explains Rabbeinu Tam, as we said we'll get to Be'ez Hashem towards the end of the limud, is that according to Rabbeinu Tam, the din of a non-bread-like dough, a blila raka, is described in the Mishnah. A blila raka is chayev in challah, in what case? Soifa Yisa, in a case where it was baked. The Rash Mishant, as we pointed out, doesn't have a Mishnah which speaks about the dinim of a blila raka. The Mishnah of Tchilosai Isa B'Seifei Sufkinin is a conventional bread dough, which you originally intended to bake, and then you changed your mind and cooked, is chayev b'challah. So too, Tchilosai Sufkinin B'Seifei Isa means a conventional bread dough, not like Rabbeinu Tam that learns it's a blila raka. It's a conventional bread dough that was then, your intention changed because originally you intended to cook it and then you intended to bake it. That's also chayev b'challah. So according to the Rash Mishant, the shaila that we're going to ask is, in a case of a blila raka, what determines the chiyuv of a blila raka? According to Rabbeinu Tam, what determines the chiyuv of blila raka is when it's baked. In the Rash Mishant, we don't know. The same way as the Rash Mishant was mechadish, that by a blila over, a conventional bread dough, the intention b'shas gilgul determines the chiyuv. So if one intended to bake it, even if subsequently one changed one's mind, you're chayiv. But if the intention was to cook it and you then subsequently cooked it, the din would be that you remain that you remain potter. So therefore, says the Rash Mishant, what determines chiyuv is one's machshava for the intended use of the isa. What about blila raka? Can machshava determine the din of blila raka? This is the din that we would want to establish according to the Rash Mishant. Now, the reason why this din is so relevant lahalacha is because, and this is relevant in bakeries, very much negei lahalacha, and the different psakim that different hashgachas follow benegei to this din, and that's a shaila which is actually originally discussed by the Teres Haaretz, which is the din of lekach. Lekach is sponge cake, where sponge cake begins as a very runny dough, but when it's baked, gets to risa de nahama and has a toyar of lechem. It's baked conventionally. So lekach would seem to be a case of tchilosoi belila raka, and labasoif it will be baked. According to the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, which is not the Ikke shita that we hold halacha, but Ikke we hold like the Rash. According to Rabbeinu Tam, even though there's an intention to bake the belila raka in a conventional way, to be goymer the belila raka as tchilosei sufkenin, but according to Rabbeinu Tam, the pashtus would be that machshava would not be malu umayrid, because the metzias of the isa determines the din. And therefore, the only way in which the lekach would become chayev in challah would only be b'shas afiyah. L'may nafkimina? Nafkimina is this: we know that for shir challah we need for shir challah we need a certain amount. We need HaRav kemach. Now, true that usually in a commercial bakery, and this can be relevant in home baking, but is usually relevant in a commercial setting. Certainly in the mixer there is a shear of challah of HaRav kemach. However, when it's baked in sheets, and in each individual sheet there isn't a shear of challah. Elomai, there are many sheets that are inserted at once in the tanur. We, mi'ikar adin, aren't choshesh to the shita of tanur being mitzaref. We either have that sal has to be mitzaref, or other oifanim in which sirup, but tanur being mitzaref, we're not choshesh for mi'ikar adin. And therefore, says the Teres Haaretz, according to the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, lekach would not be chayiv in challah, because monoshach. Mitzad, the metzius of the Isa, the metzius of the Isa is bli l'raka. It's not chayiv in challah. The machshava to bake it isn't malumayud according to Rabbeinu Tam. That later it will become chayiv because it tchilosei sufkenin b'soifoi Isa b'shas afiyah. It doesn't have the shear of challah. Azay zokt, azay cheshbon l'teres aretz. And that din, he's far kodmoi in the Sefer Chalas Lechem, where the Chalas Lechem assumes also with the Pshitos that not just according to Rabbeinu Tam does das not help to create a ptur on a conventional Isa, like we said, Tchilosoi Isa v'soifoi sufkenin according to Rabbeinu Tam. The das cannot accomplish ptur if the Isa is a conventional Isa, like we said. According to Rabbeinu Tam, the din of challah depends on the metzias of the Isa. Hu adin lehepech, says the Chalas Lechem. Das isn't malu u'murd according to Rabbeinu Tam for afiyah either. And therefore, says the Teres Haaretz, according to Rabbeinu Tam, lekach would be potter from challah. The question is what about the Rash Mishantz? What does the Rash Mishantz hold b'negeya to machshava to create chiyuv of challah? Bishloima in the ratio of the Mishnah, the way the Rash Mishantz learns, that tchilosoi isa v'soifoi sufkenin, that the machshava determines the din of the isa. So if the machshava was to use it for bishul or tigun, or to put it in the shemesh, as long as subsequently one didn't bake the isa, it remains potter. So the das determined the din b'shas gilgul. So would the das also determine the shas gilgul l'chiyuv? This is the question which we can pose. According to the shita of the Rash, what would the din of lekach be? If we hold that the din of lekach means that the lekach becomes mechuyev b'shas lisha because of the kavana, the das, to prepare it as a davar ofui, then the shas achiyuv would already be b'shas lisha. So even though subsequently b'shas afiyah there would not be a shir challah, it already became chayav b'shas lisha. Me'idach gisa, if we hold that it becomes chayav b'shas afiyah, then it would depend again on tziruf sal. In which case the din, even according to the Rash, would be the same as Rabbeinu Tam, that lekach that does not have a tziruf sal, it only has tziruf tanur. In that case, it would again be potter from the din of challah. So this is the question which you want to determine according to the shita of the Rash. What will the din be of das in a case of bli l'raka about which we don't have a mishnah, and the nafkamina will be for the dinim of lekach. And therefore, that makes an nafkamina in commercial bakeries. Is sheet cake prepared from a bli l'raka? Is it chayav b'challah? It's possible it only becomes chayav b'challah b'shas afiyah. It's possible it was already chayav b'shas lisha. And this is a important shayla lahalacha. This is important shayla lahalacha l'maisa. So let's briefly try and be oimed on where we can determine this din of how the halacha of machshava determines the din of a blila raka. So we'll begin with a cheshbon which the Rish Yosef makes in Masechta Psachim. He says the following: how is it possible that, according to the Rash Mishantz, when one prepared a blila raka and subsequently the Isa was then baked, how could it be, according to the Rash Mishantz, that Isa is chayav b'challah? HaRav, the din is that what determines the chi of challah is the shas gilgal. Horaya, that the Rash Mishan says that if the machshava b'shas Gilgul was ultimately to bake, then one's chayiv even if one changes one mind, and the way one's potter is if one's machshava b'shas Gilgul was to cook. So therefore the Rash Mishan says that what determines the chiyuv, when is it that chiyuv challah becomes set? That happens b'shas Gilgul. Rabbeinu Tam says that all that determines the chiyuv is what it is b'shas Gilgul, and the Rash Mishan says it depends what one's machshava is b'shas Gilgul. So the primigodim in Rosh Yosef in Psachim Adaf Lamed Zayin, that how according to the Rash Mishan does a blila raka subsequently become chayiv al yedei afiyah, which he proves from the Gemara in Psachim that the Rash Mishan agrees to, becomes chayiv b'shas afiyah. How could it be chayiv b'shas afiyah? Hare madoch a isa gemura that one's machshava was to be mavashalet. That p'tur remains b'shas Gilgul. How then can it become chayiv b'shas? How then can it become chayiv b'shas afiyah? Zot the primigodim. You'll ask me and counter and say that that's not true. I'll show you that according to Rash Mishant, you can change your machshava. How? Because the Rash Mishant said that lu yitzuyir b'shas Gilgul, one's machshava was to cook and bake it, and in the end one decided, if one's machshava b'shas Gilgul was just to cook it and not to bake it, but in the end one decided to bake it, what's the din according to the Rash Mishant? Chayiv. Why is one chayiv? Zot the Rash Mishant, it's a Mishnah. Tchilosei sufganin v'soifa isa means that even if one's intention was for sufganin, and in the end one baked it, the shas afiyah is mechayiv. So Zot the Rosh Yosef, so you see clearly from the Mishnah that shas afiyah could be mechayiv according to the Rash Mishant, even against my intention, b'shas, Gilgul. So that would seem to prove, says the Rosh Yosef, that the Hanoch is wrong. That according to the Rash, what one's intention b'shas Gilgul doesn't determine the din, because one can change it subsequently by baking it. So the Rosh Yosef, so we now have a stira minei bay. When it comes to the din of p'tur, everything depends on shas Gilgul. But still we see that b'negeh to chiyuv, one can change the din b'shas afiyah. How are those two principles consistent? So the Rosh Yosef shows that the Ramban, as quoted by the Ran in Masechta Psachim, and it's originally a Ramban in Hilchos Challah, the Ramban addresses this question. And the Ramban asks on the Rash, how could it be in a case where b'shas Gilgul my intention was to cook the dough, but subsequently b'shas afiyah, I bake the dough, I become chayiv. Frek the Ramban, the chiyuv challah depends on shas Gilgul, and b'shas Gilgul my machshava was p'tur, so it became potter. How then can I subsequently be mechayiv it b'shas afiyah? Azoi frek the Ramban. So the Ramban answers a dovan nifla, and the Ramban says that since what determined the din b'shas Gilgul was only a machshava, because the Isa in and of itself was eligible for challah, and it was only my machshava that I was going to cook or bake it that created the p'tur. So therefore we have a general principle that machshava can be countered by maisa. Maisa, says the Gemara, is moitzi midei machshava. Therefore, since b'shas afiyah there's a maisa, the maisa can reverse the machshava b'shas Gilgul. If that would be true, so now hagabatzmecha. We began by asking, how could it be that if one began with a blila raka and subsequently baked it, that it becomes chayiv b'shas afiyah? Hare b'shas Gilgul, it was a blila raka on potter. So we said, no, we see in the Rash Lahedya that an Isa can be chayiv later b'shas afiyah, because we see that if one's machshava was to be mevashel and subsequently one baked it, the din is it becomes chayiv. Zot the Rosh Yosef, not true. The only reason why in that case, where originally my machshava was to cook it, and subsequently I baked it, it becomes chayiv, is because maise is moitzi midei machshava. But in this case, it's a bli l'rako. Bli l'rako is a maise, it's a metzius. So therefore, in that case, zot the Rash Mishan, zot the Rish Yosef, how then is my later afiyah able to change that? He says it's only because originally there was a machshava, masha enkein in the case of the bli l'rako, where it was originally a maisa. So therefore, how do we understand that in that case the afiyah later could change the original metzius? Maisa can be moitzi midei machshava, but the maisa can't change the original maisa. Zok Rish Yosef al korchach, what we have to say is that Einochenami, even by a bli l'rako, the machshava would determine the din. And if my machshava was even on a bli l'rako to bake it, the din would be that it would be chayiv immediately b'shas gilgul. And therefore, says the Rish Yosef b'chidush nifla, that therefore it's only my machshava on a bli l'rako that I won't be baking it that allows the p'tur. And therefore, when I subsequently bake it, maisa is being moitzi midei machshava. And therefore, says the Rish Yosef, in that case, the machshava b'shas gilgul on the bli l'rako can actually determine chiyuv. So therefore, we see, according to the Rash Mishans, this chidush, which is Achronim HaMasupet, that according to the Rish Yosef's proof from the Rishonim, that the way in which a bli l'rako, when subsequently it's baked, becomes chayiv, is only because maiseh is moitzi midei machshava. Therefore, in the case of bli l'rako, we must also say maiseh is moitzi midei machshava. Therefore, the mechayiv by bli l'rako is only the machshava originally to be oifed, and al korchach, therefore, says the Rish Yosef, machshava is the mechayiv in a case of bli l'rako. This is the ikar chidush of the Rish Yosef based on a Ramban. However, we do find ladina, and this will finish the halacha chelik of the shir. We do find ladina that the poskim don't reckon with this Ramban ladina. And this is pointed out by the Chalas Lechem based on a Taz. Let's go back once more to the case of the Rash. Someone prepared a conventional isa, with the intention of cooking it. Subsequently, he changed his mind and wanted to bake it. The halacha is, in that case, Zok the Rash, that's the case of Tchilas Sufkin and V'Seifa Isa, the Isa becomes Chayiv. The Taz clears the following Shaila. He says, it's mashma from the Shulchan Aruch, that one doesn't have to actually wait until baking the Isa in order to be able to be Mechayiv it, but to be Mafresh Chala. As soon as one changes one's mind from one's original intention to cook the Isa, and one's decided to bake it, it becomes immediately chayiv b'chala. As I state in Taz. Zot the chalas lechem, in the Ramban, it says not like that. The Ramban says that the only way in which the Isa becomes chayiv b'chala, despite it's the machshava b'shas gilgul, is because maiseh of afiyah changes machshava. Zokt the chalas lechem, in the Taz it's mavur, not like the Ramban. That Avada, according to the Rash Mishans, since the original was machshava can be moitzi midei machshava. And therefore, says the Chalas Lechem, Ledina, we don't have to wait until the Isa is baked. The machshava itself will determine the din of the Isa subsequently. Of them, the Chalas Lechem, but perhaps the Taz would only say that machshava is sufficient to determine the din, despite what the din of the Isa was b'shas gilgul. Says the Chalas Lechem Edavar Nifla. He says that may only be true because the Rash Mishans also concedes to Rabbeinu Tam that the Isa itself, because it's a conventional Isa, be'etzem should be chayiv. And the only din that time that reversed that, and the only case in which that's reversed, is because one's machshava was to be mevashel. But Zok Derash Mishan, since the default of the Isa would have been Chiyuv Chala, so, and the only P'tur is because of Machshava can be like Tzimidei Machshava. But where the Isa was a Blila Rako, so the Stava would be mitzad the Metzias of the Isa, that the Isa would be Potter. Therefore, in that case, says the Chalas Lechem, in that case, Machshava would not be able to be Mechayiv the Isa, because Machshava can't determine the din of the Isa b'mokoim, that the Isa mitzad atzmoi wouldn't be oimend for that. And therefore, says the Chalas Lechem, only thing that can be Mechayiv the Isa would be actual afiyah. As I state, as I says Mavur in the Chalas Lechem. So ba'oifen, that we have a yesodistic machloikes between the Pri Megadim based on the Rishonim and the Chalas Lechem based on the Maskon of the Achronim, most notably the Taz. In the case of Lekach, when the Chiyuv Chala is Chal, could it be Chal Eidei Machshava B'tchila, or only be Chal B'shas Hafiyah? And if it would be Chal B'shas Hafiyah, we don't necessarily have in most cases tziruf besides for tziruf tanur to be mechayev in the ikar adin, and therefore it's very mistaber. Says the Torah Zorot that we can melamed schus that lekach is potter from chal. Now, the Rash Mishant, as we'll recall, and we'll just touch on this briefly, and Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder in the next limud when we discuss this sugya halacha l'maisa, Bli Neder will come back to this Rabbeinu Yoino. But we will recall that the Rash Mishant has his araya from Keneged Rabbeinu Tam from our sugya. Why, in the case of lechem asel ukutach, does the ultimate form of afiyah or non-afiyah in this case, bishul b'chama, how does that connect determine the din if b'shas gilgul the Isa was chayiv? So the Rabbeinu Yoina, to answer that question, is mechadesh davar nifla, that since it's not being prepared for achila derech pas, it's potter. And therefore he says in a blila oval that's made to be prepared b'chama and not to be in any way used b'derech pas, it's potter. The chiddush nifla that we see therefore in Rabbeinu Yoina is that even according to Rabbeinu Tam, kavana can determine the din of an Isa. The reason why it ordinarily doesn't determine the din of the Isa is because the fact that it's going to be nisbashal alone doesn't denigrate it from having a shem lechem. It's just not ofri. It wasn't baked and isn't fully ended as lechem. But where it will be lechem osi lekutach, meaning the fact that it won't be baked but it will only be cooked indicates that the subsequent use is not going to be in the form of lechem, it's going to be used in the form of kutach, and therefore its non-afiyah indicates the fact that not just will it not be ended as an isa, but its entire use is not for the purpose of ordinary pas. In that case, Rabbeinu Tam will be moideh that the kavanah for a use not in the form of pas at all, in that case Rabbeinu Tam will be moideh. And that clearly will be the Pesach to Isa that was made for Klovim. That where the Isa was never prepared for Achila, in that case Rabbeinu Tam is moideh that a machshava for it not to be nigmar as pas at all, in that case Rabbeinu Tam will be moideh that the Isa will have a patur.
What? Same thing. Oh yeah, it was okay.
So just to finish with Divrei Haggadah, the Yom Shlishi, Tuesday of this week, Chaf Daled Teves, was a Yom of Megillas, was a Yontif of Megillas Tainus. And the reason for that is described in the Gemara in Bava Basra, Kuftes Vavam Lebeis, Kuftes Zayin Amud Aleph, that the reason for that is because that was the Yom in which Chazal were menatzeach the Tztukim over a question in Dinim of Yerusha, where the Tztukim argued that in a case where someone was mace and left over a daughter and a granddaughter. Now, in the halachas of Yerusha, the din is that a bas is not yereshes im aponim. So if someone had a ben and a bas, and the ben predeceased his father, and he himself left over a bas, the bas in the lashon of the Gemara is kum b'mokam aviyah, and the bas yashens the nechasim of her father. That's the din midiraisa. The Tzdukim said that how could it be that a granddaughter has greater schus Yerusha than a daughter? Harei she is a bas that comes mikoyach the av, and this is not a bas but a granddaughter who comes mikoyach aviha. So how could it be that the granddaughter yashens and excludes the bas herself? How could that be? Mikal v'chomer, the bas should be yereshes. Madoch bas haben is yereshes. So kal v'chomer, the bas herself. As that was the argument of the Tzdukim. The pitput of Shazok and Echad pitput kenegdom v'omar, the bas should be yereshes kal v'chomer from the fact that the bas haben, from the fact the bas haben is the bas haben is yereshes. The Gemara's maskana was that l'basif nitzchum, that the bas haben is odif from a bas. The l'chara needs a beer. L'chara the bas herself is yereshes esaviyah, and b'mokim Yerusha bas isn't yereshes. So how is she odif than the bas of the? How is she odif than the bas of the av? We find in the haftarah of last week's parsha, we find a pasuk which says that Yaakov asher podo es Avram. The exact lashon of the pasuk is in the haftarah of Parsha Shmos. Lochein koi omer Hashem el beis Yaakov asher poda es Avram le'ato yebosh Yaakov le'ato ponov yechevaru. The Rishonim explain that the straightforward meaning of the pasuk is that the Rebbeinu Shalom says to beis Yaakov that Klal Yisrael should have emunah in the Rebbeinu Shalom asher poda es Avram because of the nisim that he made for Avram Avinu. But it's brought, it's based on the Zohar HaKadosh, it's brought by the Shlomo and Reb Tzadok. The Rebbeinu Shalom says to Klal Yisrael that Yaakov was Paida Avram. Klal Yisrael has a shleimus because Yaakov was Paida Avram. What does that mean? So they explain that Yaakov Asher Paida Avram means that Yaakov was the first Av who was mitosei, was shleima. Yaakov was mashlim, the tzura of Klal Yisrael to Yud Beis Shvatim. Avram wasn't yet mashlim, the tzura of Klal Yisrael. Yud Beis Shvatim were Yitzchak from Yaakov, Yishmael was Yitzchak from Avram. Yitzchak had an Esav, Yaakov Asher Poda es Avram. Yaakov completed, Yaakov, so to speak, redeemed, Yaakov elevated, Yaakov completed what the Avodah that Avram Avinu began. So Reb Tzadok explains, takes this a step further, and he says, what does it mean, Yaakov Asher Poda es Avram? He says that everything Yaakov became came from what he was Yerush from Yitzchak. What he was Yerush from Yitzchak came because that was put into Yitzchak from as Yitzchak by virtue of Yitzchak being Zerah Avram. So therefore, says the Reb Tzadok, and this is Be'ikr in the beginning of Takonas HaShavim, the sefer that Reb Tzadok wrote on the Inyanim of Yimei HaShovevim, that whenever there is an Av and a Ben, the Av places in the Ben what subsequently will be expressed by the Doros that the Ben will produce. And Av gives over to Bnoi the Bekoyach for all the Doros that will come from the Ben. So therefore we could say that b'mokum that someone had a Ben, and that Ben had a Bas, Once the Av had a ben, all that the Av is has been placed in the ben. And therefore the Bas, who comes from Benoi, is also part of the expression of the Av himself. But if the Av never had a ben, and the Av merely had a Bas, then in that case a Bas doesn't have that same koyach to be mamshech the Zera Ha'av. And therefore Bas HaBen is odif in the Nichsei Ha'av than a Bas. The Tzukim said in Svara, how's that possible? How could it be that the Bas is odif than the Bas HaBen, and the Bas is Gora than the Bas HaBen? The answer is, because once there's a Ben to an Av, in the Ben is placed all the potential of Bnei Bonim. Yaakov asher podas Avram, all that Yaakov became from Yitzchak was essentially just the Gemar of what Yaakov had placed in Avram. Masha'en Kain, in a case where an Av has a Bas, in that case it's the Yachas between the Av and the Bas is that in the Bas there isn't that Koyach of Asher Poda, and therefore the Bas b'michsei ovira is different than the Bas of a Ben b'michsei ha'av. This is the Yisod Nifla that was Mavur from Reb Tzadok and his Mubik Tzara and the Shlach Kodesh. The concept of Yaakov Asher Podo Es Avram. The concept that it's Nirmaz in Parshas Nachlos, that once an Av gives over Lebnoi, it's Nishlam, the Ibegebung, the progeny now becomes just an expansion of what the Av gave over Lebnoi. The Makam that the Av did not give over Lebnoi, then Zera Habas is different b'Yisoidoi than Zera Haben. Zera Haben has the principle of Bnei Bonim Hareim Kibonim, because once the Av gives over Lebnoi, the Bnei Bonim are Kibonim because they all are an expansion of what the Av gave Lebnoi. Masha'inkim, what the Av does not give that over Lebitoi, and therefore the Bas, even b'Nichsei Oviyah, is different than a Bas Haben in the Nechosim of Avi Oviyah. This is the Yisod Nifla that's Mavur from the Shlach Kodesh and from the Tzadok, and that's the concept of Le'ato Yevosh Le'koyam Hashem Beis Yaakov Asher Podas Avram Le'ato Yevosh Yaakov Le'ato Ponav Yechevaru. The Podas Avram means that all the ideals of Avram Avinu, everything that was b'shirish in Klal Yisrael, was given over to Yitzchak, and Yaakov is a final expansion, is the Hashlama of Avram Avinu. With that, we then understand what the inyonim of these parashiyos are. Well, we find that it's Yaakov who is the Yored LeMitzrayim. It's Yaakov's bottom, Yaakov and the Shvatim that are mishtabed, and they complete, as is Mavur in the Gemara Nedarim, the tzorech for Avram to have been Yored LeMitzrayim. The Gemara Nedarim explains that the Bris Ben Abasarim that says that there would be the Gamas Agoyash Yavodu Dono Noichi V'Achrei Ken Yitzuk B'Shus Godel, the star of Golus, as Rashi refers to Golus Mitzrayim. That wouldn't happen through Avram, and it wouldn't happen through Yitzchak. It would have to happen through Yaakov. The Yisod HaDvarim is because in this same way as Yaakov Asher Podas Avram, the Metzias of Yaakov is that Yaakov is the one through which Avram is Nishlam. Avram himself wasn't Yered LeMitzrayim, wasn't Pereh the Shtar Golos, and neither was Yitzchak. It was Avram who gave over to Yitzchak the shirish of what Yaakov would potentially be, Yaakov Asher Podas Avram. And therefore, as the Maharal says in Gvuras, the purpose of these parishes is the formation of Klal Yisrael as an Am. When they achieved the number of Shivim Nefesh, they then went down. They formed an Am. They underwent Shibud HaGoluyos. All of that is forming Klal Yisrael in the Kura Barzel as an Am. Who was it that formed Klal Yisrael as an Am? Yaakov Asher Podo Es Avram. It's the tachlis of Yaakov to be mashlim, the tzura and the shleimus of what Avram Avinu is. That Yisoid, that Asher Podo Es Avram, that in a ben is placed all the potential of the Deiros. And therefore it's the Deiros Haboyim Achareim which are ultimately mashlim what the Av gave, and therefore the Yerush B'nichsei Av. That was the Yom Tov of Megillas Tainus of this week, in which it was the Tztukim, on this taina that the Bas HaBen shouldn't be a Reshes b'Mokem HaBas, to be mechadish this concept that Bas HaBen is odif the Mokem Bas. The hemshech of an Av is in the Ben, and therefore all subsequent Beibonim are essentially just miyuchas to all that comes from the Av. And this is reflected also in the Dinim of Yerusha, where Rabbi Seinu Achroim, Rabbi Chanan, and Rabbi Ruvain, and others in Masechta Bava Basra show clearly from the Shonis and Rishonim that Bnei Bonim that are Yerush are not Yerush because they're Yerush Nachlas Avim. They're Yerush directly in the Nachla of Avi Avihem. In the din of Ayin Olav, that once there is Bonim, even if the Bonim are not Kayim, it goes Ad Soif, the Deires Lamata, who are Yerush. The Achronim then prove that's not because they are Yerush Nachlas Aviyam Bekever, but because they are directly Yorshim of Avi Aviyam. And the Yesod Advarim is Asher Podo Es Avram, that the Bnei Bonim are Yerush because of what all the potential Deiros was placed in the Ben, so that everything that then expands and is subsequently Neulad from him is all a Archova of the Ben. And this is the Yesod of Yaakov Asher Podo Es Avram, Yaakov who was Poida the Shtara Golus, to be Mashlim, the Shivud, that was Nigza Be'etzim on Avram, which was Nishlam through the Am that Yaakov Avinu formed. And Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder, in next week's Limud, we will continue with the Machlokes between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash Mishantz, as that carries through into the Sugya subsequently in Masechta Brachos, and we'll then come back also to the relationship between Chiyuv Chala and Chiyuv Bracha of HaMoitzi, which we touched on in Shulchan Aruch, and Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder will return to.